Hello, everyone, and welcome into another edition of the GangstaPriest podcast, episode 2, coming at you live today, where we're talking about the man, the myth, the legend, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, in 1984's Amadeus, directed by Milos Forman. This is a film that I've probably seen about 4 or 5 times now. I think the first time I saw it was in college. I just watched through it again today, taking notes on everything for the episode, where I actually learned that this was adapted from a stage play about 10 years prior, written by Peter Shaffer, who also wrote the screenplay for the film adaptation. The film itself is a very highly fictionalized and dramatized sort of retelling of the life of Mozart and his very fierce rivalry with Italian composer Antonio Saliere. It is a period piece, or a historical drama, if you will. It clocks in at about 2 hours and 40 minutes, 3 hours if you decide to watch the director's cut, which I would personally recommend. Unfortunately, it is not available on Netflix or Hulu, but I was able to pull it up on YouTube and rent it. It only costs about $4, and so again, would definitely recommend checking the film out. In fact, you could pause here and go watch the film, then come back, or listen to the podcast and then decide if you want to check it out or not for yourself. Now, the reason I've selected this film, if you did check out the first episode, first of all, thank you for tuning back in with me. I've been trying to get the podcast going again, and I do want to take it in a slightly different direction. My sort of goal and my frame for how I want to do this is to take good pieces of art, be it film, TV, or music, and sort of rip apart some of the themes in it. Talk about and challenge the viewer or the listener of the podcast to undertake questioning some of these themes for themselves, to take it in some good self-reflection. Art has always been a very important part of my life, and I think it should be a very important part for all of our lives, because good art sort of acts like a mirror, in which we can look into it and we can reflect upon our lives and ask questions that are ultimately going to help us grow and maybe gain some insight into the human condition so that we can better relate to ourselves and to others. Now, one thing about the film, both the stage adaptation and the film itself, both directors, again, Shaffer and Milos Forman, mentioned that this is a very, very highly fictionalized account of the life of Mozart. There are definitely some very realistic facts that were taken. There was hours spent studying the artist and trying to sort of put together some factual historical events that happened. But as any good storyteller does, they embellish the truth a bit, and they have created this arena, again, in which it can engage you, the viewer, to sort of ask these important questions that the film tugs at. These liberties that were taken, I think, enhance the entertainment value. As I've said in the first episode, if you've ever sat in a lecture or, sat in a sermon at church or read a book, sometimes it's harder for us to apply the truths learned in those than as opposed to, say, listening to someone tell a story. And I also think that good storytellers know how to embellish and to highlight certain things in order to, again, display those truths that they want to share. And film is one of the best elements for doing that. There are so many elements that make up a film, from the base of the story to the camera work to the music to the shots taken, that you can really manipulate the story in a certain way to enhance, again, some of those truths that you're trying to present. Now, at face value, if you do check the film out, one of the first things that's probably going to stick out to you is, again, it is a period piece. And as Mozart's life occurred in the late 1700s, the film is full of powdered wigs and pomp and circumstance and royalty. And that's certainly something that you're probably not too familiar with in sort of modern film and modern storytelling. But I think it's something that is important to still try and undertake in order to glean the truths that the film presents. Most of us have had an encounter with Mozart, be it through hearing his music, or if you can reminisce back to maybe junior high days and you took a few music theory classes, if you've been involved with chorus or band, you know somewhat of Mozart's life. And so again, this film will present some of those truths but it does it in a way that makes it far more engaging and interesting for the viewer. I personally have seen the film myself about 4 or 5 times, and each time that I have watched the film, I've always been able to take something new from it. One thing I found out when I was doing some research this time was that in talking about sort of creating the film when it was released, Roger Ebert, who is a well-known critically acclaimed, or was a well-known critically acclaimed film critic before he passed away several years ago, mentioned that the timing of the release of this film was very crucial because, again, the film came out in 1984, and that was right around when MTV first began to take off. And so culturally, it was very much a gamble undertaking this film, because it was something that to modern audiences might not have been very well accepted, again, just because it's a period piece. Thankfully, that wasn't the case. The film came out to critical acclaim, and since its release, I think has only grown in stature in terms of popularity and the acclaim that it gets and the importance that people recognize that the film brings to both the film world itself and then just in general, in an artistic sense, again, some of the philosophical truths that it discusses. So I thought it would be a perfect thing to talk about on the show. Again, I've seen it many, many times, and each time it's provided something profound for me to sort of gloss over. And so that's why I wanted to talk about it today. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about the plot. I kind of want to just give a brief overview of it before I get into talking about the character of Saliere, because that's going to make up the back half of this episode and talking about how thinking through his actions and his ideas have sort of shaped mine. But it is going to be important to talk through the plot, or else, if you don't see the film, you're probably going to be lost. And if you do see it, then it can hopefully help guide you in your viewing of it. Probably the hardest thing about the film, if you watch it, or the most challenging thing, and it's not something that's overwhelming, but again, since it is a period piece, there is a lot of titles in terms of the royalty that's kind of going on at the time. It's very easy to get kind of lost and confused as to maybe who a certain character is or what's kind of going on in that sense. But thankfully, it's nothing that really overshadows the story itself. One of the other things that might be a little bit challenging is that the film doesn't jump around in time, but it does sort of move forward to certain events in Mozart's life. And so on screen, it might seem like something is taking place within a day or within a week. In reality, it might have been years after the prior scene. There's no cutaways, no time cards, so it is kind of hard to keep track of what's sort of the time frame of it. But again, I think that's nothing that overshadows the plot, which is the main focus of the story, and that is very well done. I don't really think there's a whole lot that is confusing in regards to that. So to give a bit of background, if you don't know much about Mozart, Mozart was born in Salzburg, Germany, and from an early age, it was well known that he was going to be a musical prodigy. His father had a very profound influence on his life and would take him around and taught him and trained him. And from an early age, Mozart began to write operas and compositions and would just completely blow the minds of everyone around the musical field at that day and time. In his life, he would compose over 600 works, most of which have still had a profound influence on musicians today. And he would be widely known as one of the most brilliant minds ever in the history of music. Now, the film kind of centers around two main characters. Obviously, one of them is Mozart, but the other is Antonio Saliere, a man who's probably not as well known as Mozart, even to people invested in music theory. And that's something that the story, as it kind of unfolds, focuses on. Now, again, there's a lot of liberties taken with this account. In reality, Mozart and Saliere was a real person, and if you sort of look through historical documents, the two were probably, instead of really being rivals, were probably friendly with one another and worked towards one another, had an appreciation, respect for one another. But in the film, nothing could be the sort. In the film, Antonio Saliere becomes a bitter rival of Mozart. He wants nothing but revenge against Mozart, and it is ultimately the butting of heads between the two that sort of creates the drama and ultimately, sets off the action, leads to the climax of the film. To give a bit of background on Saliere, before we kind of jump into discussing the plot a little bit. Saliere was born into a very, very small town, expressed an interest in music at an early age, and eventually worked his way up to the court composer for King Joseph II in Vienna. Now, I'm not going to spend much time, again, that's the one thing that's very confusing. It's very, very different from our time period in terms of the sovereignty and the rulers of nations and provinces, and that's something that even I still can't fully wrap my head around. But all you need to know is that Saliere became a very prominent figure within King Joseph's court in Vienna. And it's here that Mozart, at a later age, ends up showing up. And that is when, again, the rivalry between Saliere and Mozart starts to set off. So I want to focus, as I did in the first episode, I want to kind of focus on one specific theme, and we're really going to be looking at Saliere, because in all honesty, even though the film is named after Mozart, Saliere is in essence the protagonist of the film. In fact, in the stage adaptation, he is sort of the narrator to the audience. He talks directly to the audience, he sort of sets the stage for the events to come. And the film begins in a fairly similar way. The film opens with Saliere in his old age, and he's at home one night. Some servants come to bring him dinner, and they're trying to get in. The door's locked, they can't get in. They're trying to get Saliere to come unlock the door, and they hear a commotion going on in his room. The servants are frightened, and so they end up breaking the door down, whereupon they find Saliere with blood around his neck, and he had attempted to kill himself. And so the men grab Saliere, and they take him to the doctor to heal him up. Now, after that, the film jumps slightly ahead. Again, this is where it's an example of the time shift, where it's hard to tell if it's been a week. It appears that Saliere's neck is not fully healed from his cut wound, but some time must have progressed, because now Saliere has found himself in the insane asylum. And so, after he finds himself there, the film opens with a priest who has come to visit Saliere. And he's come, as is his duty, to give Saliere a chance to confess any problems that he's had, and to simply talk things out with him. Now, the priest comes in fully thinking that Saliere has gone crazy. That's why he's here in this asylum. But Saliere, while he has gone a bit mad, it's for different reasons. It's not really that his mind has deteriorated. It's really his own doings that have become his unraveling. And that's what sort of sets the stage for the rest of the film. And so the priest comes in and begins to talk with Saliere and asks Saliere if he wants to confess. And so Saliere's confession becomes the entirety, the narrative of this tale. And what I find interesting is the viewer of the film, or if you again saw the stage play, the viewers in the audience, sort of sit in the same position as the priest. We become the person that Saliere is confessing to as he tells about his life, Mozart's life, and what he personally feels, as he says, is the responsibility for Mozart's death. And so, jumping into the plot, Saliere first kind of confesses and mentions how as a young boy, he was very, very interested in music. In fact, while him and Mozart had some similarities, their childhoods were almost opposites. Mozart grew up in a household where his father encouraged his musical inclinations, where he took him and taught him and trained him, and Mozart from an early age was performing for all these people in the highest courts. While Saliere came from a small town, and his father was very much against the notion of music. He was more of a studious man. He really didn't seem to care for Saliere's love of and passion of music. And so in one of the opening scenes, they are in church, and Saliere tells the priest that as a child he prayed to God. And he prayed to God and said, "Look, Lord, all I want to do is to play music. Lord, if you will make me a great composer, let me celebrate your glory through music. And let me be celebrated myself. Make me immortal. And in return, I will give you my chastity, my industry, and all of my energy towards my work." And so that line kind of sets up a bit of the character of Saliere, which right off the bat I find interesting because it's sort of a misguided prayer. He prays for something that is relatively good to be able to pursue his love. But in the back half of the prayer, he mentions for God to give himself his own glory, to make his name known. Not God's name known, Saliere's name known. And so it kind of seems that Saliere is not completely tilted towards serving God, but maybe perhaps serving himself. And that fire gets stoked throughout the rest of the telling of the story. So it jumps forward a bit, and Saliere explains to the priest that he has gotten to a position of prominence within the court of King Joseph II. He is now the court composer. Him, of all people, has gone from this small town of poverty to the highest of courts. He is a teacher. He composes. He works with the king. In fact, he is the king's teacher. And he believes in his mind that is an example that God had accepted his vow. There is no way that he would have gotten to where he was without God accepting that covenant that he had tried to make with God in his prayer. So Saliere thinks very highly of himself and very highly of music. And it's around this time that the name of Mozart starts to become more and more well-known in influencing circles. And so one day Saliere hears that this Mozart is actually going to be in town and to be visiting one of the royalties of the time. And so Saliere drops everything to go and see and to meet this man and to hopefully be inspired by him. Saliere sort of imagines maybe working alongside Mozart, and he kind of has these very, very high fantasies about the man. However, when he goes to the party, he's looking around for Mozart. He happens to go into a side room, and in rushes a young girl being chased by a young man. And there's sort of this humorous little encounter that happens. But Saliere hides himself and he watches this all unfold. And he realizes by the end of the scene that the man he's watching is in fact Mozart himself. And Saliere is just beside himself. He cannot believe that Mozart, this genius, this wonderful composer of all people, is this womanizer, this infantile man-child who is... He is a lout. He is a buffoon. Saliere just can't believe it. And so he thinks at first that perhaps it's just it's a mistake. Maybe that Mozart's genius is just a stroke of luck and eventually it'll wear out. And so he thinks nothing more of it. As the film progresses, Mozart ends up actually coming to Vienna, where he is welcomed into the court by King Joseph, who has the idea that he would like to have Mozart come and work for him. So now Saliere starts to take on this more intimate role in working alongside Mozart. And it's from here on out that Saliere grows and grows in anger and frustration towards Mozart and is just beside himself. He cannot come to fathom how God, through music, through the glory of music and the beauty and wonder of music, would use this man as his vessel, this barbaric, infantile, gross, disgusting fiend of a man. In fact, he says at one point in his telling of the story to the priest, why would God choose an obscene child to be his instrument? There's another scene where it shows Saliere's working at his piano one day practicing. He looks up and he prays to the cross and he says, Grazie, Signore, as if he's speaking to Christ. And then he goes out and he has this encounter with Mozart, who sort of shows him up in the course of the scene. And the scene ends with him coming back to the same cross saying, Grazie, Signore, but in a more condescending tone. And so, throughout the rest of the film, you begin to see, in the first half of the unraveling of Saliere, a man who has built himself up to believe that he is an instrument of God, and yet he is plagued by this man who has all the talent that Saliere seemingly doesn't possess, but none of the sort of industry, the drive, the dedication that Saliere does possess. And so Saliere begins to question himself. He says to the priest, he gave me that longing talking about God. And that, can't read my notes here, and that longing in me. And if he didn't want me to compose, to praise him with music, why implant that desire like a lust in my body and then deny me the talent? Eventually, Saliere has had enough. And there's a very interesting scene where he throws his cross of Christ into the fire and says, well, you know what, God? If you're not going to honor me in my vow, then forget you. I now work against you. I am now going to be devil's advocate. I'm going to do everything I can to be the unraveling of Mozart, to bring him down and to laugh in your face. And so for the back half of the film, that becomes Saliere's drive. In every instance he can take, he attempts to thwart Mozart from moving up the sort of music community ladder to try and shut him down and to thwart God in what he believes is God's attempt to bring his glory to the earth. Mozart, on the other hand, seems to have the opposite sort of effect. As the film introduces Mozart, it's well known that he is a genius, that he's this brilliant man, that he is a wonderful composer, a mind unlike anyone else. But as the film progresses, and this is one of the themes, not saying I want to talk about today, but there's sort of a shifting of culture in the old versus the new, which is always a struggle for the artist. There are old themes, things that have been accepted for a long time, and when someone new comes along and tries to break those molds, it can be very, very hard. And Mozart often finds himself at the behest of the Italian court that King Joseph has surrounded himself with, the Italian composers. They all seemingly do everything in their power to keep Mozart from growing in influence. And this disgusts Mozart. He believes that he is far more brilliant, far more genius, far more risk-taking in his musical endeavors than these men are. But as the film progresses, you see that Mozart starts to unravel in his attempt to overthrow sort of some of the cultural values of the time. He begins to lose out on propositions to make money. He finds himself losing more and more of it and having less work coming in. It leads him to drink. It leads him to madness. On top of all this, his father, who is a very influencing figure in Mozart's life, almost chastises him and has this very degrading impact on his spirit. And so again, there's a whole lot that goes on, and I simply don't have time to talk about all of it, but it is this establishment of Mozart trying to become what he thinks he is supposed to become, and Saliere doing everything in his power to prevent that again sets up the stakes for the rest of the story. And so, as I mentioned at the start, I want to focus really in on the character of Saliere, because he's the one that I have personally had the most struggle and the most challenge with. The two main characters in the film adaptation are Saliere is played by F. Murray Abraham, who has done several other films. He's maybe not a recognizable face unless you are very well versed in film. He was in Scarface, which was pretty big. I can't think of something else off the top of my head. And then Mozart is performed by Tom Hulce. If you are a Disney lover, he also performed the voice of Quasimodo in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Both men give excellent performances. In fact, both were nominated for an Academy Award at the time of the release of the film, and F. Murray Abraham did in fact win for Best Actor in a Film. The reason I find him so engaging is, especially as an artist, is he to me represents the struggle that is art. And his viewpoints and sort of his emotion and the way he emotionally reacts to Mozart, I can connect to in some similar ways. When I first saw the film, I remember that I didn't dislike Saliere. I just didn't really empathize or connect with him as well until the second time that I watched it. And it was upon my second viewing that Saliere became my favorite character. That I would find myself in my head quoting many of his lines, wondering many of the same things, as I was going through some of the struggles that he faces internally in the film. When I watched the film this most recent time, it was a lot more split down the middle. There were things that I could relate to with Saliere, and there were things that I was taken aback by and thought, wow, he's going beyond the line. Wow, I would never want to be that. And I think that's very reminiscent of our walk in life. As you grow, as you learn more things, as you experience new things, our thoughts and feelings change. And it's his character that still, even though I've felt sort of these different feelings towards him, that to this day I think challenges me the most. I think the interaction and the internal monologue of Saliere is very fascinating to me, again, because it is the most challenging. One of the questions I want to ask before I kind of undergo the rest of discussing this, and I want you to kind of ponder this for a little bit as you sit and undertake maybe some of these thoughts that I've had, but have you ever had a dream? Something that you've always thought in your heart is something that you were supposed to be doing or called to do or wanted to do. And have you ever believed that you could be the best? Or that you could be a top dog in your craft? Or that you could be someone that has an influence? And I honestly, genuinely want to know that. Because I personally have. And I've always found it hard to sort of connect with people because I haven't found too many people that have that same drive or that have achieved success in the art realm. It's a very, very difficult thing to do, and that's been the internal struggle of my life for 6 or 7 years now, which is something, again, I will get into here in a second. But I want to kind of dig a little bit more into this character of Saliere first. But as we do so, again, I want you to think about that. And if you do, comment below, reach out to me. I'd love to hear, because I'm going through this learning process as much as you are. And when you respond, when you give me that dialogue, that helps me to learn and grow as well. But so jumping back into this, when Saliere first kind of encounters Mozart, I think the first problem is that, first of all, early on as a child, Saliere recognizes something that he loves and that he invests in. That, I think, is a natural thing. I think all of us, when we were younger, had something that we gravitated towards. For me, that's acting. There are other things that I don't give a rat's ass about. You might be a baker. You might love baking shows and love creating things. I like to cook every now and then, but that's not something that drives me. That's not my passion. Others of you might be invested in cars or sports or bird watching, or there's all sorts of different things out there. But I truly believe that everyone has something that sort of drives at their heartstrings. And I think that's a good thing. I don't think there's anything wrong with Saliere recognizing that, especially at an early age. But I think the problem, especially as seen in his prayer in that opening scene, is that he has, first of all, the wrong frame of mind towards God. Saliere sees God as this sort of almost reminiscent of the courts that he serves in his day and age, that God is supposed to be this person that is exalted, and we are his servants, and Saliere can take part in that. And by requesting God of this, by going to him with a request, if God wants his services, which Saliere seems to think that he has said yes to, then God will then give him the tools he needs to perform. And I don't think that is the most accurate view that we can have of God. I don't think God is this person that provides to our demands or gives us whatever we want. It's just not simply how he works. I think the second problem at Saliere is that he has this idolization and then this sort of downward spiral in his view of Mozart. I think it's good to have heroes. I think it's good to have people that we look up to in our lives. But when you start to become obsessed with someone and idolize them and demand to or desire to be on the same page as them, that can create some problems in our lives. And you see that, again, in his downward spiral of his view of Mozart. He begins to grow angry with Mozart, to be jealous of him, and that all sorts of becomes this fire that grows and grows and grows and ultimately leads to both men's demise. And I think the third problem is eventually, again in the scene where he pitches the cross in the fire, is his complete and utter rejection of God and then his bent to destroy Mozart. And I don't want to ruin the third, kind of act of the play and what happens. Eventually, and if you know historically, Mozart did pass away from an early age. There's a lot of speculation on what actually caused it. But in the film, Saliere believes it is he himself who caused that. He sort of devises this plan in an attempt to lead to Mozart's demise. A very cruel and wily plan, and he acts upon it. And he genuinely believes that he is the one that led to Mozart's downfall. He talks about the madness within him and the madness that grows. And it's the madness that sticks with him the rest of his life and leads him in the insane asylum. And so it's sort of that view that really has challenged me again and has caused me to think, and some of the reasons why I wanted to focus on that day I wrote on that specifically today I wrote down. In fact, before I go into this, I want to play real quick, just so you can maybe get a better view of Saliere's desire and his hatred of Mozart as the film progresses. This is a quick little clip. There's a scene where Mozart has gone to a party. He's kind of trying to unwind and get his mind off things. And so they play this game, and it's kind of like musical chairs. If you don't get into a chair when the music ends, you have a penalty. And so someone in the room tells you something to do, and you have to do it. Kind of like Truth or Dare. And so Mozart's penalty is that he has to play the piano in the style of a composer, but play another composer's piece. So he performs it first, then they flip him over, he plays it upside down to kind of show off his brilliance and his genius. And so he decides, I want to do something else, and he asks the crowd, give me another composer to play. And so he gets a couple suggestions, he writes them off, and then Saliere has happened to come upon this party, and he's there. It's a masquerade, so he's got a mask on, and he says out loud, play Saliere. And so Mozart goes, oh, that's a challenging one. And as he plays it, he mocks Saliere because he thinks very little of Saliere. And so this is the scene. I'm going to play this again. Hopefully this will come through just fine.
Mozart laughing, but it was God. That was God laughing at me through that obscene giggle. Go on, Signore, laugh. Laugh! Show my mediocrity for all to see. One day I will laugh at you. Before I leave this earth, I will laugh at you.
Alright, so again, that was Saliere talking to the priest and talking to the party, and that was kind of a lengthier clip this time than the prior episode. That just kind of shows you his intent, and eventually his desire to see the destruction of Mozart as a character. And so kind of jumping back to myself, I want to ask you if you were able to answer those questions that I asked. Because to answer them personally, myself, and this is going to kind of turn into, I thought it'd be interesting in the play, or in the film, you see Saliere's confession, to kind of spend the last few minutes here as sort of my own confession, and some things that I've learned, and hopefully can pass on to you. I felt from an early age, the thing that I noticed that I was inclined towards was acting. And being in front of people, and talking to people, even as I'm doing now. I've always loved being around people. It's just something that drives me. But at times I always felt like a stranger. I felt like some of the things that I was trying to push myself towards and the things that I was engaging in, I wasn't necessarily seeing that in my community. One of the earliest places that I can remember finally being around like-minded people was when I went to a conference, the Hugh O'Brien Youth Leadership Conference, when I was a sophomore in high school, which would become a very integral part of my life in the next 8 years as I attended and then served as a volunteer for the next 7. It was there I met people who sort of had higher aspirations for their lives and sort of wanted to push themselves and give something back to society. And as I've gotten older, this is something I would never ever, this is partially coming from a place of ego, But I don't want to say these things to you to think that I am looking down upon people who don't have those aspirations. That's not necessarily my drive, but rather, it's hard when you don't feel like someone else has that. You begin to wonder, like, is this a natural feeling? Do I need to get past this? And so it was a bit comforting to me to at least find some other people who sort of had that same drive. And I remember in school I always had the desire and the drive to give 100% in everything, whether it was sports, whether it was in music, and that's carried with me to this day in my work. I have always wanted to be the best that I can be. Another thing that was very hard for me in school and growing up was that I often picked things up very quickly. Whether it was exams, there was days where I would study or not study at all. I'd study maybe the night before, not study at all, and I would ace an exam, where other people had studied for weeks and would not do as well as me. I would write papers last minute. I would do speeches last minute and improvise them. In fact, in college, I remember we had a big paper we had to work on. It was like 20 pages long, and it was a big senior project. There are people who worked on that thing for a month, and I did mine in 4 hours in one day, and got a pretty high grade on it than other people. Now again, I'm not saying this to sound arrogant or say, well, that makes me better. That's not my mindset at all. But just to simply state that I have always felt that there are certain things that I've just been able to pick up easier than other people. And that has sort of created in me the drive of, well, God has gifted me with intellect. And just like Saliere, I want to use that intellect to bring glory to Him. And so how can I do that? What's my passion? And my passion, again, has always been acting. There's something about being on stage or being in front of the camera, of being able to dive into these characters and present them in a way that it is a craft. It takes a lot of hard work. And it's something that not just that I was invested in, but I felt that I had the talent to do. It certainly is a mix of ego and confidence, and I've often wondered if that's a good thing. But then I also challenge myself with, if the people that were the greats in their professions didn't have that sense of ego, think of Michael Jordan or, I don't know, that's the first person that comes to mind. I've been watching the Last Dance documentary, or Mozart in this film. If they didn't have that confidence in themselves, and yes, it certainly was a lot of ego as well, and pride, but if they didn't have that, then we wouldn't have their works, the things that they did. So I think that there has to be a bit of that present in order to pursue whatever it is that you want to pursue. The problem that I have, and that you see with Saliere here, is coming to God as a tax collector, with this idea that, well, God, you owe me something. As Saliere says, you put this lust, you put this desire on me, God, and I prayed you. We have a bargain, so you got to own up to it. I have found myself having that mindset before. Maybe not as strongly as Saliere, but there's definitely been times where I have felt, God, you gave me this desire, and yet nothing in my life, no matter how hard I try, no matter how hard I knock at the door, or sacrifice, or do the things that I feel like I have to do to get there, nothing seems to work. And it's aggravating. It's frustrating. And so I can connect with Saliere on that. And I can also connect on Saliere's feelings towards Mozart and his jealousy towards him. Jealousy is never a good thing. We all, I think, know this. But it's not until you actually step back and sort of think about it that you can really maybe start to fight that jealousy off. Art is a ruthless thing. If you've ever done anything in theater or in film, it is a battle. You're going up against other people. Your body is your instrument, and so it's a very, very difficult and challenging thing. And you're going to experience a lot of failure and rejection, and you can't take it personally. I remember one time, one of the hardest things that I had to swallow, and because I don't want to gossip, I'm not going to exchange names, but several years ago I was involved in community theater. And I don't want to say I've ever looked down on community theater. It's a good thing, but it's not professional. The people that do community theater are in it for the fun of the community. It's a hobby. It's not a profession. And I remember I was in a show. We did a showing of Beauty and the Beast. The organizer of the theater had really wanted me to come in and audition. She knew I had talent and wanted me to take place in it. And I was kind of looking to move towards the city at the time, up to Chicago. But I said, you know what, this will be a good undertaking. So yeah, I'll come audition. And so I auditioned for 4 separate parts and got callbacks for all 4 of them. And if you're not familiar, a callback is basically there's interest in you for the part. So you come back, it's the first round of auditions are over, it's kind of been whittled down, so you have a good shot of landing a part if you're good. And I got callbacks for 4 parts, so I thought I was a shoo-in for one of them. And at the end of callbacks, I was not asked to take a single part out of any of the parts that I had called back for. And the thing that aggravated me the most was one guy in particular who had never acted before, who had never taken a class before or trained, got a part over me. And I remember that just eating me up inside. It felt like a personal attack. It felt like, again, just like Saliere towards Mozart in this film, here was something that God gifted in me, a passion that God gifted in me, and now someone else who has not sacrificed the way I have, who has not had the drive that I had, is getting the reward of getting to do what I want to do over me. And then watching him getting the praise and the approval of people. It was a sickening thing to me, and I know that maybe sounds bad, but I want to be upfront and honest with this. And it was hard, and it made me question myself, my ability, and go, maybe I'm not all that I think I am to be. Excuse me. Now, I never took it as far as Saliere. I've never wished, murder upon anyone, or I've never really held that revenge in my heart. It certainly still, I think, bothers me to this day. Not something that I lose any sleep over, but I can connect to it. And it's challenged me in wondering, sorry, my phone here is getting low, so I'm going to try and plug in. I do want to try and wrap this up. I know I'm further than I normally want to talk, and I know that's one of the things that many of you have critiqued me on. I'm working on it. I know I got to get better at it. It's a work in progress. There's just so much to talk about, and I like to talk. But I lost my train of thought. Shoot. I lost my train of thought. Unfortunately, I do not have editing software at this time. As I mentioned in my first podcast episode, my laptop is unfortunately down. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump ahead and try and wrap this up with some final thoughts that I had going into this. This movie, one of the things that can be taken out is kind of the Cain and Abel story. If you know the story of Cain and Abel, they were 2 brothers. They both came and presented their tithes to God, their offerings. God accepted Abel's offering, he did not accept Cain's. And this left Cain very angry, very frustrated. He felt as though he was betrayed by God, that he had put in all this hard work and God spat in his face. Which again is almost as if Saliere in this film, or perhaps my feelings towards that man, or my life in general. And I don't know. I do not know. I do not have any answers on this. If you're someone who answered those questions, and you've said, yes, there is desires I've had, or yes, there are things that I feel like I'm called to do, I wish I had answers for you and could tell you to pursue that and God is going to reward you for that. It simply has not been true in my life. It has been a long uphill battle. I have failed time and time again. I personally have felt like a failure because I went to school for this and I've made sacrifices for this and have tried my hardest. It's obviously a very, very difficult field to get into, and I'm not giving up on it yet. But much of my life has been devoted to it, and so to sit back and to feel at the end like I haven't achieved or haven't provided or haven't proved myself is a very, very difficult thing. And I also am always worried about getting so obsessed. I think Saliere's other problem in the film is that instead of becoming focused on God, just as I mentioned that first prayer, instead of becoming focused on God, he becomes focused on the music and himself. And that's never a good thing either. And I wonder that too many times, if God is preventing me from what I feel like I'm supposed to do because I'm focused on the wrong things. Or maybe I'm not even supposed to be chasing those things down. I still do not understand, again, another line from the film, but why would God place this desire in me, this lust in me? This isn't just a passing thought or passing fancy. This is a daily thing to want to do this thing. Why would God put that in me and give me seemingly the talent, only to shut the door in my face at every turn and avenue? And I know some of you listening are going to tell me that's not the case, and I know that. But it's hard. We're a product of our circumstances, and when it feels like that, it can be hard to shake that. But there's 3 things here three little final kind of thoughts that I had, and they all come in verses, not from the Bible, but things that I've written down. And I just want to share these real quick and maybe give you some encouragement. So the first is this: Christian life is action, not a speculating, not a debating, but a doing. One thing and only one thing in the world has eternity stamped upon it. Feelings pass, resolves and thoughts pass, opinions change. What you have done lasts in you. Through the ages, through eternity, what you have done for Christ, that and only that you are. And so that just gets me to think that at the end of the day, again, Christian life is a doing, not a speculating. And it's the things that we do that's what's going to be lasting. And the things that we do for Christ are the only things that are going to last. And so that's one thing that I want to encourage you today, is to ask yourself in your life, are you truly committing and devoting yourself to those things? And if not, if there is a struggle, if there is some kind of tear, if there is a questioning, again, I don't have the answers. One of the best things I could suggest is to go to God in prayer. And even then, I feel like I don't always get answers on the things I pray about. But I do feel like that is at least a start, and perhaps getting you down the path towards an answer or towards some more peace of mind. The second thing is this: the bravest are surely those who have the clearest vision of what is before them. Glory and danger alike, and yet notwithstanding, go out to meet it. I want to encourage you, if you answer that question, to dream and to dream big, and to never, ever put God in a box, or to think that, well, God can't do these things through you. I come from a small town. Some of the guys listening to this, our town was 1,900 people between two small towns. I went to a school that had a graduating class of 65. It's not a place where typically greatness is found. I have always tried to buck that trend. I've always tried to believe against that, to believe that something great could come from that town. And again, that's a bit of the ego speaking there, to think that I am, well, who am I to think I am this great person that can do this? But again, the bravest are surely those who have the clearest vision of what is before them. Know thyself. I have searched my soul. I believe this is what I'm called to do, and so I'm going to continue to pursue it at all cost, until perhaps it's the undoing of me. But for now, that's what I feel like I'm supposed to do. But finally, the last thing is this, and this is a warning for myself and perhaps you listening. A man cannot fulfill his purpose if he is living for applause, approval, and affirmation in this world. It simply will not come. Not enough, certainly, to answer the needs of his soul. If a man lives for the glory of God, he stops looking for affirmation from human beings after every good deed. He throws himself into his role unselfishly and contents himself with knowing he is fulfilling his purpose in the world and pleasing the God who made him. I honestly believe that is the deepest desire of my heart, to be utilized by God, even if it's just a fraction, to bring glory in some sort, to create something of lasting impact, just like these films do for me. That's what I love, again, about film and art so much, is that these artists have created something that challenges me. And I've always wanted to just be able to do the same through my work, and to be able to not just entertain people, but to bring them things to push themselves forward in their own lives. But feelings do pass, and thoughts do pass. Saliere experiences this in the film. As he gets to an old age, he realizes nobody cares about Saliere anymore. He proclaims himself as the god of mediocrity. But the cautionary tale there is that Saliere can never shake his love for himself and his hatred for God and Mozart. From the minute he starts going down that path, he never comes back. And that is a dangerous path to tread, one that I am always fearful of going down. And so it's a daily challenge to ask myself, am I going down that path? Am I pursuing God, or am I pursuing myself? And I don't always have the answer to that. I'm just being honest. I'm certainly not perfect, and I am a work in progress. But my hope is that in the midst of all that, in the craziness of life, that maybe, just maybe, God could use me for something greater than myself, greater than what normally is, the normal, typical life. I don't want to just live, go through life and die. I want my life to be dedicated towards something. And I hope that you can share in that. Whatever it is, whatever your dream is or your passion, I would want you to think about it. And you can comment. You can talk to me. I'd love to engage in discussion with that with you, and perhaps some more about how this film has kind of shaped my viewing of it. That being said, I do want to wrap up. We are way past my time. Again, I apologize. I got to get better at doing that. But there's so much to talk about, and I know sometimes I ramble. In the future, if you did check into the old podcast, it was a lot more edited down. And again, unfortunately, right now my laptop is having a bit of an issue, so I got to try and work through that. And the means that I'm doing this is basically a one take, which is not the most proficient or efficient of ways of doing things. But I do hope to continue to get better at that in the future. If you are continuously listening to the podcast, I do kind of have a slate of films that are coming up ahead in the pipeline. You can check that out on my Facebook. The next episode, which will hopefully be dropping on Wednesday, is going to be on the film Casablanca. Much shorter film, so if you are watching these, that will be a quicker watch. But we'll be looking at Casablanca and the theme of love and sort of what romantic love leaves and some of the problems and the good things that can lead to. But again, that'll be dropping on Wednesday, so if you stick around, be sure to check that out. As always, like, share, and subscribe. It really is a big thing in the whole YouTube world. If you have any critiques, lay them on me. I am an open book. I want this thing to get better and to be the best experience it can be for the audience. Thank you from the bottom of my heart if you have listened to this episode. It means a lot to me, and I hope that I can just continue to perform and give you the best of myself. And I hope to see you back for episode 3. As always, thank you. And until next time, we'll see you then.